number of important ways, and it's part of the reason why I think it's part of the digital humanities project, is this interesting perspective that being digital brings and a new way of thinking about doing something like this. So I've been involved in 5 different prosopographies, all with significant structural orientation. So the material is presented in a rather formal fashion, and there's links between them and so on. Those of you here building databases already know something of what I mean. And I think we've had very good success with these different projects. But of course, they're all rather different from this project in that there's a formal team that works on them, and the team works closely together to develop an understanding of what the structure means to what the material is that's being put into the system. So for the Anglo-Saxon prosopography, we spent an amazing large number of hours trying to sort out and never completely resolving the distinctions between occupations, between offices, and between status terms. And of course, there is no completely satisfactory resolution of these different ways that people spend their lives and the titles and the way in which they're recognized for the things that they do. There just isn't a completely satisfactory answer to that. But a great deal of time is spent on that. Now, the RMMA aim is to produce an environment where people can read material without sitting through these long meetings where such things are discussed. And how does that transform the nature of what the product that comes out of this? If we produce an environment where this material can be built, what's that structure going to be like in the end? Well, I think it's a rather much more open structure, open in 2 senses. First of all, there's all sorts of different contributors putting material in. But we also want to build something that although it's a central point for putting material in, it also points out all the time to other resources that perhaps you as contributor are also building, or other objects that you know about. And we'll be demonstrating, Raphael will be demonstrating in a little bit, a connection between our prototype RMMA project and a Americans who turned up in the Paradox of Medieval Scotland project, which we're much involved in. So there's, in this sense, there's a series of questions around authority and quality control around this material. In a sense, we didn't have to worry about that for our closed prosopographies. We assumed, and I think rightly assumed, that the people who were signed on to the project brought along their own issues around authority and quality control already. There was mechanisms built into that in the traditional parts of the practice that work towards those issues. And I think in an open contributory system like what this project might be like, there's a bunch of questions to think about there. Related to that, therefore, is a question around process of material, submitting material, and it has to go through a process of some type of peer review. Charlotte just mentioned that a couple of minutes ago. And we again didn't particularly need that in any so much of a formal way for our previous prosopographies. And the final question has to do with, let's call it simplicity of entry versus sophistication or of expression that these entries create. The environment in which we built this mechanism, which is called EAT, and I'll have a few words to say about that in a couple of minutes. If you put up the date screen in its original form, there were 43 fields to fill in. And the reason why there were so many was because dating is an enormously complicated business, and you want to be able to put in all the different types of subtleties about the problems of getting dates attached. But of course, for our projects, we didn't have 43, but had a good number of fields. We had time to prepare our data entry people to understand what they should do. Well, for this project, I don't think it's going to be like that. So we have to find some way of balancing off the need for precision and accuracy versus the need for relative simplicity of putting the data in. Another challenging issue for this project is naming of people. Another whole set of questions and with different cultures, the practices and the issues are quite different. And how are we going to resolve that adequately in an environment which is meant to work across the study of many different cultures and so on. And a final area that I can think of right off the top of my head was having to do with geographic places, and questions around that, and questions around the administrative connections with these places, their connections with the various governmental systems, or in the church with the diocese and the ecclesiastical structures, and all of those types of things, which also enormously complex in reality, but you can't necessarily expect that the people putting the data in are going to be able to cope with all the different possible alternatives that there are. So we have an interesting question in this project about figuring out how to make something which can be open and produce something which nonetheless is coherent and rich enough to be really useful. And I think that's part of what genuinely interests me about this. If I may say one more thing about this. Is this the first project I've been involved in where we build the software before we talk to people? And it's not generally considered a good practice. And indeed, the only redeeming feature of this, I think, is, as Charlotte's already said, the software here is meant to be shot at by you. It's not meant to be something that you say is wonderful. We're more interested in hearing about where serious deficiencies are. We took up an environment called EATS, which I forgot what it stood for, stands for Entity Authority Toolkit, which was developed in New Zealand, no less, and has been used there for many different institutions to collectively identify people and places and things of that nature. So the various archives all contribute material to this environment. And we thought, well, this starts to talk about the issues of somewhat open, somewhat collaborative. They recognize the issue of authority in the environment already, and so it provided a reasonable starting point. And so we, mainly being my colleague Raphael, has built an environment, transformed that to a certain extent to meet the somewhat different needs of this particular project. And I think it's probably time now for Raphael to talk us through a little bit of what the EATS version of RMMA is like.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so as we said, this is a prototype, and it's been built with the idea of having something to show when we meet at these workshops, so that we have something tangible, and we can put some data in and see how it could be structured. So anything that you're going to see now is it's a prototype. It's meant to be changed. It's meant to be a reflection more than something that's supposed to be working. Also, at the end of this very short presentation, I'm going to give you some logins. I created users for most of you. If you're not in, just raise your hand. I can create one, so that you can try maybe to get one or two Medikey and try to look at that on your own at home between today and tomorrow, maybe if you want to use a speed or something like that. But yeah, so I think that the first distinction that we need to do is a distinction between users and contributors. This is necessary. This came out when we had to deal with the fact that this is a prosopography that is not controlled by just one group of scholars, but the idea is that each individual scholar can submit their own data, their own research. So the idea is that we have to come up with a sort of dichotomy. That is, user is who actually enters the data, and the contributor is who takes responsibility of this data. And within our database, then we can have a large amount of different contributors, and each bit of information that gets into the database is always attached, let's say, to who contributed it, and that's the way to make sure the responsibility is always clear, and that's how you can. Yes.
And what that reminds me is of what I forgot to say about when we're talking particularly relevant to this point. If we continue, if colleagues agree that this is something we should do, and if we don't decide just to stop because it's not going to work, we envisage, in the first instance, we envisage the whole project having a phase 1 and a phase 2. And phase 1 will be exploiting the scholarship which already exists. And that's where this distinction is going to be particularly important, because you have a graduate student and you give them so-and-so's book on Anglo-Saxon doctors, and the graduate student sits down and is the person actually entering the data, but the scholarly contribution has come from the person who wrote the book. Now, so this distinction is particularly important in phase 1. In phase 2, it seems likely, once we open it up, for people to start adding their own material, one would imagine that the distinction, unless people are still going to be asking their graduate students to do it for them, I think that the distinction is going to disappear.
Yes.
But for the first few years, to clarify our minds, it's important to remember that we would be taking authoritative texts already published and putting the material in as a start point, and that's when this applies.
Yes. And yeah, but the important thing that I want to bring forward is the fact that there will be several contributors, there will be several authorities that are part of this kind of growing database. So that is the system that we were thinking of using to make sure that there is responsibility. And the reason why we need it is because you can use that both to say this is the data that contributed, and also to say, well, even if we're talking about I as a scholar and another scholar talking about the same medicus, I'm saying something, the scholar is saying something else. So this would allow us to deal also with ambiguity, with non-agreement and things like that. So basically, every contributor makes a sort of assertion, and we thought of at least 4 different entities that contributors might provide data about. So the first one would be Medically, because that's the main topic of the database. But then a more generic people, Medically, people too, but people basically stands for every other person that is not a medicus. Places and institutions, and all of these can have sort of relationships between each other. And the idea is to be able that once that data is inserted, that you can also point out to either secondary sources or directly to other databases. And that would be quite important to make sure that it's possible to create connections with existing data that is already out there on the web, for example. And also, ideally, also to primary sources. But this is, I put a question mark here because this is something that we need to discuss more, because we haven't quite devised a system to do that yet, and the debate is open whether each single information gets put in should also have a reference to a sort of either a text or a manuscript, or if we want more of a generic pool of sources to put at the end with each entry and things like that. Right, so each contributor submits data. This data could be a new medicus, or maybe changes to contributions that you already made, or maybe you're adding information to a medicus that already exists. So the idea is that they would, with the growth of the database, there will be a collection of different entities, and it is possible to then contribute data about them. So the contributor doesn't contribute necessarily a new medicus every time. You might just contribute detail about the medicus that is already present in the database. That's why the way that we thought of entering information, for example, will always go through some sort of search first. So you make sure that that the medicus that you want to write something about is not already in the database. If it is, then you're considering to add more information if something is missing, more than submitting a duplicate or something like that. And the idea is that before all of this information goes live to the public and becomes available, it will have to go through some sort of editorial board, and this will be this is another crucial topic of discussion, because it's important that we figure out how that process would work.